In this next section, we're going to start talking about social influence, basically how being around other people can change our behavior. So first, we're going to talk about mere presence. This is the idea that simply having other people around can change your performance at particular tasks. So it can change your behavior. So this was first discussed by Triplett, who was looking at cyclists, and he found that cyclists would perform better. They'd have faster race times when they were racing against opponents, as opposed to when they were just running their own trials against the clock. So their performance was improved when there were opponents around. They followed up and started looking at children who were performing physical tasks in the lab, and again they found better performance when there was another child co-actor in the room. Basically, when there was another person present, performance was improved. So overall, they were finding that the mere presence of either an audience or a competitor, some other individual, could enhance performance. But that wasn't the full picture. Sometimes you end up actually seeing the opposite, where having an audience makes performance worse. So what's going on when that happens? So another researcher, Zajonik, which is not pronounced very well, but basically they proposed that the presence of others was actually increasing our overall emotional arousal, and it was making us more likely to perform what he called our dominant response. So what is our default behavior in this particular situation? If it's a new or a complex task, our dominant response is going to be to make errors. It's going to be to do something that isn't quite right, and we'd start seeing a drop in our performance. But if the task at hand is something that's simple or something that's well known, something that we know exactly what we're doing, our dominant response then becomes to do well at that task. And so this whole idea is called social facilitation, which is basically this increased tendency to perform one's dominant response in the presence of others. So when there are other people around, then you're going to do whichever behavior comes most naturally. So when the task is easy, when the difficulty of what it is that you're doing is fairly simple, you can usually do the correct response. If the task is hard, it's challenging or complex, you're usually going to have behavior that is incorrect. So this tells us that when we're trying to learn a new or a more complex task, it's probably a good idea to learn this task when there aren't other people around. So when you don't have an audience. This leads us to the idea of social norms, which are basically shared expectations about how we all think that we should act and behave, and just sort of how we govern our behaviors. These social norms can be part of established rules or laws, but in a lot of cases, our social norms are more implicit, things that you don't necessarily talk about. They're just things that you know. They're going to regulate our daily behavior without us being consciously aware of them. Though you can very quickly be made aware of these social norms when someone contradicts them. So my favorite example of this is if you're standing on an elevator and you're on the second floor and you're going up to the fifth floor, and somebody gets on the third floor. You're probably standing in the elevator facing the door because it's the way you came in, that's the way you're going to go out, and you probably have made lots of space for anyone else who joins in the elevator, and you're just going to stand there and face the door. If this person gets into the elevator and faces away from the door, or if they stand too closely to you, all of a sudden you're going to feel uncomfortable. And part of that is because this person who has entered the elevator is breaking social norms because they're behaving in an atypical fashion. They're not following these unspoken rules of how you're supposed to act in an elevator. And of course, these norms can change between different cultures, And even within cultures, they can change over time, which is good to keep in mind. Our social roles are going to build on that idea of social norms, because social roles consist of a whole set of norms that are going to categorize how people live in a particular social position, and how they ought to behave when they occupy that position. So each of us can have multiple social roles, and we can run into situations where those roles may clash. That's where we get something called role conflict. So the norms for the different roles that you occupy don't necessarily agree with one another. So you could be a student and maybe you're an employee, possibly a spouse or a parent. All of those roles are things that you might fill. And each of those might have different expectations, different rules that you should be following, different norms that are going to govern your behavior. And that conflict comes when sometimes they don't quite line up. And we can also run into issues where our social norms and our social roles can interact in really weird ways that cause some uncharacteristic behavior. So an example of this would be the Stanford Prison Experiment, which I usually end up talking about because it's so closely related to ethical issues. It was an experiment where a bunch of undergraduate students were assigned to be either prisoners or guards in a mock prison setup. And it was fairly unethical because the experiment had some pretty negative outcomes. There was lots of violence and poor treatment of people, and the experimenters didn't step in to stop the experiment. But in this case, we're actually going to be more focused on the idea that the bad behavior, the reason that it ended up being a fairly unethical study, came out of this social role. So those who had been assigned to be guards took on the role of guards. They viewed the others as prisoners as opposed to fellow students and treated them as prisoners. They acted in a way that they thought that guards should act, and a lot of times that behavior was very atypical for them. It wasn't something that they would have done following their own roles when they weren't part of this experiment, but because of the experiment, they took on the role of a guard, and it changed their behavior in very dramatic ways. So, for example, some guards would physically attack the prisoners who weren't behaving. Maybe they were rude or aggressive, threatening people. And all of these things were, in their mind, part of the role of a guard, but it didn't necessarily line up with their views as a student or as a person in general. So there's some really interesting conflicts that can happen there. Now, this idea of social norms and social roles seems to exist wherever humans form groups. But it's interesting to note that a lot of social customs are fairly arbitrary, and they seem to change with time. And they don't, when I say arbitrary, they don't necessarily link to anything in particular. Back in the 30s, a researcher found that you could have social norms developing in randomly selected groups over fairly arbitrary things. So this specific experiment was looking at a projected white dot in a dark room. And they asked students if they observed the dot moving. And for reasons that we won't get into here, there's sort of an illusion where if you stare at the dot for long enough, it feels like it's moving, so people would report it as having moved. So people would report about how much they thought that the dot was moving, and it ranged from a couple of centimeters to up to 30 centimeters at a time. And people tended to report about the same number. But if you put people in groups and allow them to hear what other people were saying, how much they thought the dot was moving, slowly the groups began to converge And eventually they all reported the same amount of motion. So they converged and started reporting the same amount of motion. So they were adopting their own culture, or their own social norm. So they had converged on a group perception of that motion. And so this can happen in all sorts of places, and it seems to happen in all cultures. Basically, whenever you go looking for the formation of these norms, you run into them forming. People placed in groups seem to universally converge on standards for behaviors and judgments, which is kind of interesting, which I guess is why we're talking about it. And as part of these norms and things that we see across multiple cultures, you can see things like women taking on certain roles. What is their social role within a particular society? How you greet people, how you interact with people, how you stand in elevators. All of these can be social norms. And the example that the textbook uses, there's usually an image here, but that's fine. There's a movie, The $1 Million Baby, which shows a woman trying to be a professional boxer, which at the time that the movie was taking place was sort of a confrontational or a non-common type of role for a female to take. So it would have been something that people would look on as strange. It broke those cultural norms. But as time goes on, then it's become more and more accepted that that's something that anyone can do. It doesn't matter what your gender is. You can be a boxer if you want to be a boxer. So similar to this, these roles seem to change over time, basically depending on what people are exposed to and what that society deems as being the new norm.